Forgotten Coast Outdoors with your host, John Spohrer. John Spohrer has been an outdoor writer and photographer living on the Forgotten Coast for over 25 years and is the author of Florida's Forgotten Coast, a compelling look at the land, plants, and animals that make the Forgotten Coast a natural experience.
Hello, I'm John Spohrer, and welcome to the Forgotten Coast Outdoors. Today we're going to take you on an adventure in Apalachicola Bay, and we're going to see how the world-famous Apalachicola Bay oysters are harvested. In addition, we're going to see a little bit about the sea life that lives in Apalachicola Bay, and we're going to show you some mighty pretty scenery. One of the great things about the adventure that we're going on today is this is one that you can go on with very little trouble and in complete safety, because we're going with Journeys of St. George Island. Now, our guide today is Russ Knapp. Russ, thanks for having us along, and tell our audience a little bit about what they can expect and the kind of things we're going to be seeing today.
Okay, we're going to do a trip today. It's called Bounty of the Bay. We're going to go out and we're going to have Captain George out there. He's going to get some oysters for us. He's going to net some mullet. He's going to pull some crab traps. You get to keep everything we catch, so you have dinner to go home with you. It's a really nice trip. It's about a 3-hour trip.
And how many people can go on that,
We
Russ?
take 4 on that. We can do 5. It's a little crowded with 5, but if there's small children or something, that's fine. But it's a tremendous experience if you've never done anything like this before, to see where seafood really comes from.
And so you can do this any time of year?
Yes, we do it pretty much any time of year. January and February, of course, it's pretty cold, so I probably would pass on that. But yes, any other time's fine.
Now, I've got to admit that when I was a little younger, my tendency was just to jump in the boat and go. But as I've gotten a little older and wiser, I find that a few precautions will definitely help you enjoy your time on the water. And the first of those precautions is the proper hat. A wide brim hat like this one, doesn't have to be expensive, and with a chin strap on it, so that when you get out in that boat and the captain puts the pedal to the metal and that wind starts blowing it off, you still got your hat with you. Because for most of the time, it's going to cost you a 6-pack if that captain has to turn around and go get your hat, so it can pay for itself in a hurry. Now, the next thing, I don't care what anybody tells you, it's a forecast. I don't care what the weather looks like before you leave. It's probably going to rain while you're out there. And you don't need some lightweight poncho. You need a rain suit. Doesn't have to be a real expensive one, but it needs to be one that has pants and a coat in it and that you can get into when that rain starts coming down. The coldest I've ever been in my life was in a rainstorm on Apalachicola Bay in the middle of July, because once that rain starts coming down, the temperature drops, the captain revs up the motor to get home, and it can get mighty cold. People talk a lot about staying hydrated with water, but my tip is to start drinking the water as soon as you get up in the morning on the day that you have a trip. Try to have at least 36 ounces in you an hour before you get on the boat, because I don't care who you are and I don't care what your talents are, it's going to be a lot easier to use that bathroom standing on land than it is in that bouncing boat. Good sunblock is another thing you just can't afford to be without. Now, this is some sunblock that you can get right here at Jeannie's Journeys. They sell this, and this is an amphibious formula, and this is a sun protection factor of 36. You need to put it on before you go out, and you need to be sure that you keep it refreshed while you're out in this hot sun. And remember that even though you have the hat on and you're blocking the sun rays from the top, just like you can see here, that sun's coming off the water, and it's really giving your face a pretty good dose of UVs. I recommend you take a little hand towel like this, and the hotter it gets, the more important this little hand towel is. Because whenever you start feeling a little weak and that sun coming down, there's nothing like putting this hand towel in that ice chest, getting it nice up with water, and putting that around your neck, and that'll really help you prevent any kind of heat stroke possibility. You'll want to have a plastic bag with you. This will help you if it starts raining. You can put your stuff in it. You can put your bag, your major bag in it to keep it dry. And if you don't use it for anything else, take some garbage back out of the water, off the water with you. A little coolie, just in case you happen to have your drink, or Might even have a beer there. That's going to help you out there too. So a few little things, and you'll enjoy yourself a lot more, and you'll be happier the next day. So we're here today with Captain George Ward. George, it's good to see you again.
Good to meet you again.
And George is from a long line of seafood dealers and seafood harvesters here in Apalachicola Bay. George has not only makes a living oystering, but also catching mullet, and that's his food and that's his livelihood. George, these are some darn good-looking oysters you got here. Looks like they come up here. They come up in clumps, we can see. And how do we get them out of these clumps, George? What's the next step here?
Well, John, you have to have what we call a cull iron, and this is what they call a cull iron. And the oysters have to be 3 inches. So between here and there is 3 inches, and that's what
that's the way you measure them there to see if it's a legal oyster, huh?
So this is a legal oyster, so we can keep him. And what we do is whenever they bird up, like this one right here.
So this is a cluster. This is dead oyster shells, and this is live oysters in the same clump.
So what we do, we take the cull iron and beat them out. We measure them, and that's what we keep right
there. So we
there.
call this a double. That's two oysters.
That's a double.
That's a double. It's 2 oysters there. That looks pretty easy, George. How long have you been practicing that?
About 35 years.
35 years. So with 35 years practice, you see there's nothing to it at all.
Yeah, it takes me about 2 weeks to get in shape to be able to do it all day long. But what we do when we see them like this right here, we knock the little oyster off and we keep the big.
So eventually you're going to shovel all of this or dump all of this coal material back in the water, and this is what the new oysters grow on.
Yep. See the little baby oysters right here? One here and there on that shell. And they'll grow up to be bigger oysters. Especially whenever they tong them up, break them loose, and scatter them back out, they grow a lot faster. And
George, normally you would take these oysters now off this and you would refrigerate them, right, for about 24 hours before you'd eat them?
Yes, sir. Most of the time, whenever you kind of put them in a cold area, it makes them get firmer.
But you can eat them right out of the bay here, can't you?
Yes, sir, you sure can.
Let's try that.
Alrighty.
That looks like a good-looking oyster there, and he's got his oyster knife. And George, this is called healing, right?
Yes, sir, this is healing.
And you're coming in where that oyster's joined there, and you're going to break that apart.
Yes, sir.
The knife.
And break the bill out.
Now the oyster's held together by its muscles up here. Now he's going to cut the muscles. There's the oyster. That's a pretty looking oyster.
Yeah, it's real
We're here at the end of May. George, you hear a lot not to eat oysters unless the month has an R in it, but that looks like a pretty good oyster there.
What it is they spawn during the month of R, and they have the spawn in them and they don't taste that good. And plus, whenever it's so much heat in the summertime, they don't hold up that good.
Well,
so that's the reason why they want to put them right on refrigeration, especially in the summertime.
So that's a darn good looking oyster there, Apalachicola oyster. We're not going to ruin this with any crackers or any hot sauce or anything. That's going right down the hatch there. Oh, that was horrible, George. Do another one.
All right.
I tell you what now, these oysters are as plump as they can be. And they've got a nice salty taste to them. George, what's some of the things that determine whether or not an oyster is going to taste salty or not?
Well, it's according to how much fresh water's in the bay.
It's like we haven't had any rain for quite a while now.
You know, if we get a bunch of rain or a bunch of water come down the Apalachicola River, it'll make them fat and firm, and plus it makes them grow better. Oyster has to have nutrients too to make them grow good.
So this is what making Apalachicola Bay so great for oysters. George is talking about, there's all the nutrients that are washing down the Apalachicola River, and the barrier islands here, St. George Island, Dog Island, and St. Vincent Island, are helping to keep that water from going, and those nutrients that are in the water, from going out into the open ocean and being lost. So the oysters are growing real quick here because of the amount of nutrients that we get down, and also because of the heat. An oyster here to grow to a legal 3-inch size limit in Apalachicola Bay takes about 8 or 9 months. That same oyster in another famous bay like Chesapeake Bay might take 2 or 3 years to get to that same 3-inch size. George, let's see if this one tastes as good as that last one. I don't know. I think we got a little bit more research to do here on Apalachicola Bay oysters.
A lot of times about oysters growing in certain spots is according to how much salt water. Like down at Goose Island, that's on down to the east of here, it has a lot of salt water, and they don't grow that big, and they get burred up. Then, but when the winter time gets here, we get a little bit more fresh water, and they get big enough to catch.
So George, as part of the trip you do with Journeys of St. George, you bring a family out here and they can eat these oysters just like I'm doing now.
Yes, sir.
And also they can take some home with them?
Yes, sir. We generally get them about a 5-gallon bucket for them to take home.
Now George has a commercial oystering license, and that's why he can do this. But you can also, if you wanted to go through the work, the time and the effort, you could also pick up some oysters yourself, as long as you have a saltwater fishing license. So as soon as we get through going through some of these good oysters that George has brought up for us, we're going to go over to a bar that's out of the water, and we're going to try picking up some ourselves and see how we do there. You know, it looks easy enough when Captain George is using these tongs to get the oysters off the bottom. So now, after a few tips that he's given me, I'm going to give it a try. And the tip that he gave me, the main tip was that I didn't want to do this. So we're going to give it a try, and you can see that these things are like scissors, that whenever I pull apart, that they open at the bottom. And I'm going to drop them down there, and I'm going to try to rake me up an oyster or two. And look at that, I got me some oyster shells. Well, you know, I think Captain George was right. Using the oyster tongs is just one way that the harvest of the Apalachicola Bay is brought on board. Now Captain George is going to show us how to use a mullet cast net. And this net here, we see, is an 8-foot net. And that means that half of it's 8 foot long. And by the time he throws this thing, it's going to be 16 feet across. And we're going to come over here and we're going to let Captain George show us how he catches mullet with this contraption.
Got it.
George, that was a nice throw there. What we've done is we had to get out of the boat because the boat was scaring the mullet. And George has come over here now with the net. And that's Mr. Mullet. We're going to be letting him go here in just a minute. But that's Mr. Mullet, and that's what we've been throwing for. And if we were real hungry, he wouldn't have a chance to get back in. Nice throw there, George. Nice catch. We've gotten out of the boat now, and we're on one of the exposed oyster bars here, and we're going to look a little bit at the ecology of what makes up these oyster bars. Now, these oysters locally are called coon oysters, and that's because whenever they get up out of the water, the raccoons can come out and eat them. You can harvest oysters, a certain number of oysters, recreationally, and the limits change and where you can do it changes, so you have to check with the Marine Patrol before you go out. One thing you'll need is a saltwater fishing license, but when you have a saltwater fishing license and you're in an improved area, you can come out and what we call hogging oysters, that is, are picking them up by hand. And so these clusters, and you see these guys behind me, that's what they're doing, they're hogging oysters, and these clusters contain live oysters. You'll need a culling knife and you'll need a glove so that you can open the oysters here, but this is one way of doing it. Now, it's a lot easier to let someone like George get them for you, but if you want some hands-on experience, this is one of the ways that you can do it. Now, the way that an oyster bar works is that when the oyster spawns, the little baby oyster, the egg, the fertilized egg, floats around for a few weeks. And as it gets heavier and as its shell starts to grow, it starts to sink to the bottom. And so when it's sinking, if it lands on a hard surface, like another oyster shell, then it attaches and can grow. And that's why there's these clusters of oysters. But if it lands in mud or sand or something that it can't grab onto, it dies. So oysters beget other oysters, and that's why you get oyster bars, is the new oysters growing on the shells of the dead old oysters, and that's what begins to build up these structures out in the bay. Now, the oyster bars themselves are also home to a lot of other different kind of sea life. Both the fishes that feed upon the fungi that grows on the oysters, the crabs that eat the oysters and eat the small arthropods that live along the oyster shells. I'm going to walk around here and pick up some clumps of oysters and see if we can't find some of the things that live symbiotically with the oysters. Let's find something now. I don't even see a conch. You got a conch? Good. Naturally, whenever you have such a great food supply as oysters, you're going to have predators besides humans that find their food there. And here's two of them we see right now. And this is a Florida horse conch. And what this thing does to predate the oysters, it drills a hole in them and sucks the oyster out. This shell right here doesn't have the original conch anymore, but unfortunately we won't be able to see it. But there's a hermit crab that's taken over this shell and has crawled way back down in there. And that's one of the things you should remember if you're out on an oyster bar and you see these shells. Before you take any of them home with you, you want to make real sure there's not another creature living inside it. And truthfully, most of these shells, especially whole ones like this, will have hermit crabs in them. This is the Florida lightning whelk. It also feeds upon the oysters. This is the shell of a dead one. You can see that oysters have started to form on them. These are barnacles that are living creatures that have attached to this shell. And so we see a lot of symbiotic relationships of predator and prey living on the oyster bars. Okay, now we're at the hole actually, of one of the biggest predators on oysters, and that is the stone crab. And if you remember with the stone crabs, they have those great big claws, and those great big claws are used, they use them to crack open the oyster shells and then eat the oyster out. And so what we see here is this light area is where the crab that's down in this hole here has dug out, and he lives down in that hole, and he forages on he comes out and forages on these live oysters that are out here, and that hole may go down a good long ways. I'm not obviously going to stick my hand in it, but I'm going to see if I later on maybe can't talk George into doing it, although I don't think he's going to do it either. But this is the crab hole, and these live oysters around here. Let's see if we can find some of the shells. These are some of the shells that he's cracked open, some of the shells that he's dug up to make his hole, and some of these other shells here are shells that he's cracked open and eaten the oyster out of. There's one, he's cracked that one open. Get a lot of parts of the oyster shell down there. The stone crab is one of the major predators on oysters. I want to talk about two threats now to the oyster bars that are not natural threats, or not natural in the same sense that the predators are. And one of them is the red tides that Florida suffers from. And when the red tides come in, these are algae that are in the water, poisonous algae in the water, and the oysters, since they're filter feeders, they ingest these algae, and so the oyster bars and the production of oysters have to be shut down when there's a red tide. So if there's a red tide, first of all of the oyster grounds will be closed, and if you check with Florida Marine Patrol, they'll tell you that, but you have to be real sure not to come out here and collect and eat these oysters if there's a red tide. The other threat is more directly related to man and man's works, and that is restricting the flow of the fresh water that comes down the Apalachicola River. Right now we're in litigation, we being the state of Florida, in litigation with the state of Georgia and the state of Alabama over how much fresh water will be allowed to flow down the Apalachicola River. And that fresh water, bringing the nutrients down the Apalachicola River, is directly responsible for the number of oysters that we have here. And the only way to save the seafood industry down here, the only way to perpetuate having the oysters and the lifestyle and the jobs that go with them, is to protect the Apalachicola River and the fresh water that comes down it. Write your congressman. Of course, as humans, we have to remember that we share the Apalachicola Bay and its incredible bounty with many other creatures that depend upon it for their lives and their livelihood. All of these birds that we see behind us here are raising their chicks here on what used to be the causeway between two bridges that connected St. George Island with the mainland. Nowadays, as you come over to St. George Island on the new bridge, you see this causeway to the east as you come over to the island. This is a major bird sanctuary now, and it's one of the really good things that have happened for wildlife here in Franklin County, has been the new bridge and leaving this area for the birds to nest. We have all kinds of birds nesting here, all kinds of shorebirds. We have laughing gull, we have royal terns, we have least terns, we have oyster catchers. I believe there's some pelicans nesting here now. And what this does is provide one of the few places left within our seashore environment where these birds can nest and raise their young. One of the most popular forms of do-it-yourself seafood here on the Forgotten Coast in Apalachicola Bay are blue crabs. And what we've done here is pulled up to a trap, the Captain George crab trap, that Captain George set last night, and he baited it with the backbones and the heads of speckled trout that he's been catching. And so, as you can see here, The captain has got quite a bounty of blue crabs in here. Look at those things. Boy, that is a good catch. Let's pull up here close and see if we can take this crab trap from Captain George and have an up-close look at some of the crabs that are in there. And these are some beautiful, beautiful blue crabs. Look at that. I said we weren't going to take them back with us, Captain George, but I just don't know. Those are beautiful crabs. Now, a couple of things if you're planning on doing this yourself. Again, you have to have a saltwater fishing license, and I believe that the current limit right now is 5 traps per people. They sell these traps at Fisherman's Headquarters and at at Survivors Bait and Tackle, and another number of other places on the island here in Apalachicola and in East Point. And they've got a well down here that you put the bait into, and then the crabs crawl in after the bait, crawl in right here through this hole, and then they can't get out. Now you have to remember, whenever you're culling out your crabs, when you're looking at your crabs, that it is illegal to keep female crabs. And I'm going to show you right here. This is a male crab, and you can see that this little part right here is very thin. And on a female crab that's carrying eggs, this is going to be very thick. This thing that's called an apron is going to be very thick, and there's going to be a spongy orange mass there, and that's the crab eggs. And so if you get the female crab, you have to put them back. Looks like, though, George has got a pretty good catch here of all male crabs, and it looks like those are going to cook up and be some real good eating there. George, again, that's just a great catch and another example of the bounty of Apalachicola Bay that we want to preserve. George. Well, we're back from a memorable adventure on Apalachicola Bay, and I'd like to thank our 2 captains, Captain Russ and Captain George, for showing us a great time today, showing us some of the traditional means of harvest of seafood on Apalachicola Bay, showing us many of the creatures that make Apalachicola Bay its home. And if you want to have the same adventure, remember Journeys of St. George Island. Give them a call, go by and see them. They're located up on Pine Street in the main part of the island, and you can go out and have the same kind of experience that we had today. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Prudential Resort Realty, for making this show possible and making possible Forgotten Coast TV. Thanks for joining us. We're gone.